Wars may not be won by heavy attack or defense for months. A well-planned defense and attack mean nothing but the loss of ammunition and soldiers, unless supported by a strong purpose, will, and faith. We saw this in Ukraine's Bakhmut conflicts. A breakthrough applied at the right time and strategy can change everything. The world saw this many times in the Second World War, whether it was the Blitzkrieg of Germany at that time or the Normandy landing. This has been proven time and time again. When such critical breakthroughs in conflicts are implemented at the right time and with the right strategy, success is inevitable. The Ukrainian army also goes this way and can sense the right strategy and the right moment in the conflict. The breakthrough of the Ukrainian forces this week aimed at ending Russian domination of the entire Black Sea coast. Ukrainian troops pierced the enemy defenses. The Ukrainian armed forces almost destroyed the Russian military bases on the Azov and Black Sea coasts, indicating that the attack took place in several directions on the southern front last week. Malheur continued as follows. During the 2-week offensive operations in Berdyansk and Melitopol directions, Tavria defense forces liberated a total of 8 settlements, namely Novogeorgievka, Ladana, Storagev, Mukievka, Blaherdatin, Lobkov, Niskichny, and Pyatakotki. Ukrainian troops broke through the Russian lines up to 7 kilometers in Zaporizhia and up to 3 kilometers in the Melitopol-Berdyansk line. The recovered land area counts for 113 kilometers squared. Russian troops stationed on the southern bank of the Dnipro received heavy blows. Ukrainian defenders dealt blows to the invaders in Henichesk, Skadovsk, Rakov, and Luzern in the Kherson direction. Ukrainian forces destroyed several important Russian-occupied ammunition depots in Kherson. They also destroyed a critical train logistics line, Russian military trains, and a major Russian base. Yesterday morning, powerful explosions were heard in several temporarily occupied settlements of the Kherson region on the coast of the Black and Azov Seas. Ukrainian media reported explosions at warehouses and bases of Russian troops. Rakov is a port city about 20 kilometers from Henichesk, a port city on the Sea of Azov in southern Ukraine, which has been occupied by Kremlin forces since the first days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The city is currently under Russian occupation. Rakov is about 120 kilometers from the areas controlled by the Ukrainian army. In the morning, loud explosions occurred in the city of Henichesk in the Kherson region. According to eyewitnesses, the explosion occurred in the ammunition depot of the Russian army in the suburbs in the village of Partisan, where the granary hit their land, according to local residents. There was a large warehouse of ammunition belonging to the invaders. Activist Sergei Stano noted that it was a very good hit, blasting for several hours and could be heard from far away. Ukrainian forces then announced that they had destroyed an important ammunition depot near the Russian-occupied port city of Henichesk, south of Kherson. While the Russians were unloading shells, a Russian military train was attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces. They announced that a train belonging to the Russian army was attacked during the unloading of ammunition at the Partisan station. There are many dead among the Russian army loaders, he said. Odessa Military Administration spokesman Sergei Bradshaw said in a video released on Sunday morning, "Our armed forces dealt a heavy, loud blow in the morning hours on the village of Rakov and Henichesk district in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson region." The information was also confirmed by Petro Andriushenko, advisor to the mayor of Mariupol. The attack on the Russian military facility was recorded at around 4 a.m. Judging by the reports from the locals, there was a large ammunition depot there. Locals stated that they heard the sounds of bullets. A few hours after the hits, it is assumed that the Ukrainian forces used Storm Shadow missiles to hit the Russian military installation. While Russia has not yet made a statement on this subject, Ukrainian troops continued to intensify their attacks. Later, explosions were reported in Skadovsk and in the village of Lozorno in the Kherson region's Skadovsk district, in the territory of the Solnechny children's camp, which the invaders had turned into a military base. Also in the urban-type settlement of the Kherson region, Henichesk region, explosions occurred in Rakov on the territory of the grain elevator. There have been explosions for several hours, and smoke rises into the air. According to preliminary data, a hit was recorded in a large warehouse with ammunition. On the other hand, conflicts intensified in the Donetsk region. During the conflict, the Ukrainian army and the Berdyansk direction pushed back the Russian invaders through the gap between the Ruzgan and Novodonetsk settlements in the Donetsk region. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malias stated that the Ukrainian army carried out both offensive and defensive operations in the last week of the offensive operation on the southern front. The Ukrainian army has tactical success and is advancing. Minister Maliar stated that the fighters of the armed forces of Ukraine are advancing up to 2 kilometers in each direction, while the Ukrainian offensive continued at full speed. Russian President Putin's words, such as confession, entered the world's agenda as Ukraine continued to advance along the front line. A confession-like statement came from the Russian leader, Putin, speaking to state media. Putin said many things were missing during the special military operation. Putin admitted that he did not have enough drones, fighter jets, or ammunition for the war in Ukraine. Putin admitted that Russia sorely lacks the firepower it needs for the war in Ukraine. This happened despite Russia increasing its military production capacity. For the second time this week, Putin spoke of the shortage in Russia's arsenal. The Russian leader said on Friday on the Kremlin's website that his forces do not yet have enough modern weapons for war. The overlapping confessions of Russian leader Putin came from Ukraine's recapture of lost territories, despite Russian President Vladimir Putin's statement that his army is experiencing a shortage of missiles and drones. Russia's bombardment of Ukraine has increased in recent weeks, indicating that the Russian army continued its attacks in the Lyman, Kupiansk, Avdiivka, and Marinka directions last week. Deputy Minister of Defense Maliar stated that they did not lose their positions in these regions. Defending that the Russians have deployed additional troops in the east to stop the advance of the Ukrainian troops in the direction of Bakhmut, Maliar said, the intensity of the clashes in this direction decreased last week, but the clashes continued. A total of 41 clashes took place, and our troops made progress in several areas, she said. After the start of Ukraine's long-awaited offensive, Russia resorted to a new tactic. Russian soldiers used a suicide tank against Ukrainian forces. In the published footage, it was seen that the Russian soldiers were filling their hollow tanks with explosives and driving them with remote controls towards the Ukrainian trenches. It was stated that the tank in the new video footage was a Ty-54 and contained 6 tons of explosives. In the video in question, it seemed that the Ukrainian soldiers are making intense efforts to stop the tank. The tank hit a mine and was destroyed, causing a massive explosion. Russia had used this tactic at least twice before, but the explosion was caught on camera for the first time. Stoltenberg, who made a statement regarding the Ukrainian troops' progress on the field despite all of this, stated that this could be the turning point of the war, emphasizing that the more gains Ukraine achieves, the stronger its position at the negotiating table will be. Stoltenberg said, as Ukraine gains territory, the possibility of Russian President Vladimir Putin understanding that he cannot win on the battlefield and negotiating for a just peace increases. Then, while answering a question about Ukraine's possible NATO membership, Stoltenberg stated that the Allies had previously agreed on many issues regarding Ukraine's NATO membership and reminded that Ukraine would become a member when the right time comes. The West has made it clear that it will ensure Ukraine's security for many years to deter Putin and his followers from their predatory ambitions. Detailed security guarantees will be provided to Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, it is said that the West has about 35,000 soldiers, supported by a little more than 100 battle tanks. As the war with Ukraine dragged on, things got complicated at the front. The situation in the Russian army is getting worse. Vladimir Putin's war is not ending. The soldiers that Russian leader Vladimir Putin sent to the front to fight are against the Kremlin officials sent to suppress the rebellion. While Russian President Vladimir Putin is making preparations for new plans to attack Ukraine, he can resist neither the war between his soldiers and their commanders nor the rebellion movements launched against him. Soldiers locked in basements for refusing to be targets are trying to make their voices heard. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is not getting out of trouble. For Russia, the attempt to invade Ukraine continues with disappointment. Russian leader Putin faced a new uprising after the killing of large numbers of reservists. Russian President Vladimir Putin has to contend with endless insurgency as he seeks a way to increase the effectiveness of his military operations in Ukraine. Russian forces continue to suffer significant losses on the Ukrainian front, and things are getting worse for Moscow every day. While Russian soldiers and commanders refuse to fight, hundreds and even thousands of Russian soldiers are changing sides and fighting for the Ukrainian side. When Russia launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin said that only professional soldiers would participate in this special military operation. But in September, everything changed. Putin declared partial mobilization and hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens were recruited. Most of those recruited were soon sent to the front without adequate equipment or training. The Russian soldiers who were sent to the front with only a few days of training and were sent to their deaths deliberately without any equipment or weapons do not want to fight anymore. Those who refuse to fight are either tired of fighting or do not want to fight because of mistreatment. They wait in the trenches, hungry in the cold, and on top of that they get scolding and swearing from their commanders. Russian soldiers who are forcibly sent to fight at the front say that they were sent for slaughter, that they are disposable soldiers looking at the faces of their commanders, and that their only chance to return home is to be wounded in combat. Soldiers are waiting for help because they don't even care about their commanders. On the other hand, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky emphasizes that Ukraine has dealt hard blows to the Russian army and that they will suffer greater losses and that they should be prepared for this. According to new information, Russian soldiers are having to battle chronic health conditions, which has caused UK defense officials to issue warnings of possible riots in Moscow from family members. According to British defense experts, many Russian soldiers have to serve in Ukraine due to serious health problems. Troops forced to build trenches under fire inflict particularly heavy losses. Under great pressure to achieve their goals, Russian commanders risked further casualties by forcing the weaker troops to the front. Although they outnumber the Ukrainian forces by a third, Russia's artillery and infantry units are struggling to act in harmony under limited opportunities and difficult conditions. Russian troops in Ukraine are being beaten more and more every day. It is already known that the newly recruited Russian soldiers within the scope of the mobilization were sent to the front with only a few days of training. And even some of these soldiers who were sent to the front have already lost their lives. Dozens of conscripts enlisted after mobilization declaration have hoisted the flags of rebellion against Vladimir Putin amid growing unrest over his invasion of Ukraine, which did not go as Putin had hoped. Putin's failure to achieve his military goals in Ukraine did not create opportunities as well as causing many social tensions. And the confusion continues to grow with each passing day. With mobilization uprisings, internal conflicts and internal turmoil, Russia is experiencing a lot of wear and tear. With the withdrawal of the battlefield commanders one by one, the lack of ammunition, and the lack of sufficient food, water, and no humane conditions to burn, the soldiers had no strength to stand on the front. It is said that especially when tanks and artillery bombard the soldiers, the company commanders did not provide cover and support and were sent to their deaths with only assault rifles. It is clearly explained in the images taken by the Russian soldiers that the command does not care about the soldiers and that they are put forward to fight alone at the front. Most, if not all, mobilized reservists have not served before. Moreover, many are likely to be forced into service with serious chronic health conditions as their medical conditions have not been adequately studied. In their statements, the soldiers state that they were deceived, that they attacked as soon as they arrived at the front and remained in the forefront. They say that the third or fourth line, as Vladimir Putin mentioned, does not exist at all. Similar complaints about the plight at the front were raised many times by the soldiers before. Now they are asked to be sent to different military units so that they do not fight for their rights. On the other hand, the crack in the Russian army is getting bigger. There is a war within a war in Russia. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is trying to deal with mounting pressure as soldiers refuse to take up arms and their morale on the battlefield has plummeted. Vladimir Putin continues to take a hit in the war effort as hundreds of Russian soldiers have reportedly been arrested for rebelling against their military commander's orders. We can also say that a new one is added to the increasing acts of rebellion by Russian soldiers against Putin's military authority. Confidence in the commanders was shaken as a result of tactical and strategic miscalculations by the high command and insufficient medical and material support. Those who refused to fight at the front were detained. They were forced to dig trenches. Soldiers were allowed to eat only one meal in a day, while they had to fight in poor conditions. Unable to withstand these conditions any longer, soldiers began to revolt as they suffered from failure and chronic weapons supply problems. Also, the MOD Defense Intelligence Update shows that the Kremlin is likely to be concerned that an increasing number of families are prepared to risk arrest in protest against the conditions of their relatives faced in the war. Ukraine first started to very serious intelligence work in this region. This intelligence work would pave the way for the Ukrainian army to squeeze the Russians at critical points. The reason why Ukrainian soldiers took such a big step was, again, the difficulties experienced by the Russian army and to support received by Ukraine since the Ukrainian army had taken the lead. Putin decided to send a large number of tanks and vehicles to the region. Thanks to these breakthroughs, it became clear that the Russian army wanted to end the war, and the propaganda in the media started to show that the Russians would be victorious. But the unbelievable operation of the Ukrainian army showed once again to the whole world that Ukraine was in the lead in every sense. The Ukrainian army was about to achieve a huge victory against the Russians. Then they learned that a large number of tanks were coming towards this area. The Ukrainian army decided to line up their tanks and vehicles near the route. This step against the Russians put the Ukrainian soldiers in a position to change everything. This operation has been recorded as the biggest damage to Russian tanks and Russians so far. After it became clear why Russia was going to come from the Ukrainian army, had its tanks near this area. However, the Ukrainian army started preparations to show how superior it is against Russian tanks. A convoy of Russian armored vehicles and tanks began to arrive near this area. In response, the Ukrainian army lurked in ambush to deal a huge blow to the Russians. When Russian soldiers arrived in this area, they did not expect Ukrainian tanks to be nearby. The group was therefore relaxed and surprised to see Ukrainian tanks. But the Russian tanks who wanted to use their numerical superiority were at a loss. The Ukrainian soldiers were aware that they were in a position to achieve a very big victory against the Russian army. After the Ukrainian army ambushed the Russian army with its tanks, the Russian soldiers expected to win. Thinking that even though it was an ambush, the Russian tanks, the T-90 were stronger. But in response, the Ukrainian army dealt such a blow to the Russians that the Russian army was in such a position that it could never rise again. Ukraine started firing with American Abrams tanks and German Leopard 2s. When the Russian soldiers showed the damage to these tanks, they were at a loss. They began to realize that the Ukrainian army was winning the war with these tanks that could take down a tank with a single blow. The Russians counterattacked, and they started firing at the Ukrainian army with T-90 one after the other. But the Russians had a very big problem. The T-90's firing missiles at the Ukrainian army could not even penetrate the armor, much less blow up a tank at a time. Seeing this, many Russian soldiers began to flee back. The Ukrainian soldiers then took another huge step against the Russian army and started airstrikes. Since there were no air defense systems in this area, Ukrainian soldiers took advantage of this, and the Ukrainian army won its historic victory in tank battles. The Russian soldiers faced a huge tension, and the Russian army faced a huge challenge against the Ukrainian troops by raising the surrender flags with the ammunition and military personnel. The Ukrainian army won a great victory over the Russians. Putin was furious upon hearing of Ukraine's victory with the Russian army fleeing and surrendering the few tanks it had. The Russian army was faced with great desperation. Putin, fearing that if he continued in this way, the Ukrainian army would win the victory completely in a very short time, began to give only one reason for Ukraine's victory. And he made a very critical decision. In recent days, the Ukrainian army has started to win very big victories against the Russians. This has allowed the Ukrainian army to take certain steps at different points to capitalize on the advantages it has gained. The main reason for this is the support the Ukrainian army has received. But it is also very important that it has many advantages over the Russian army. Since Putin saw the support as the main reason for the victory, he started to threaten all the supporting countries. While these threats caused many countries to take cover in the international arena, put into a very different step, and he decided to deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus. Now, things have reached a completely different point. The world, divided into two different blocks, faced a huge crisis for the first time since the Cold War. The West and East are on the brink of war. After that, every step Putin would take had a different critical point. The Russian army was aware of this and started preparations. A large number of countries are aware of how big a problem the nuclear threat was. started to provide a lot of support to Ukraine, and things have become quite comfortable for the Ukrainian army. But the comments made by war analysts on this issue have been echoed all over the world. According to the war analysts, the Ukrainian army was able to end the war in a very short period of time. While this is in direct proportion to the growing advantage of the Ukrainian troops, it is also important that the Russian army is also facing enormous difficulties. The Russian army is now beginning to transition to a period of escalation. Thanks to this, the Ukrainian army has the capability to attack more and more every day. Putin is well aware of these problems and is constantly pursuing an offensive against the Ukrainian army since these attacks have repeatedly caused losses against Ukraine. Things have become quite complicated in Russia. Putin thinks that in order to win victory in this region, you need to attack more, while the rest of the Russians are moving much further away from that. This kind of breakthrough and a lot of inconvenience is causing the Russian people to become more and more angry and to organize bigger and bigger protests against Putin if things continue like this. The Ukrainian soldiers will soon be victorious. And as a result of these breakthroughs, with the Ukrainian army winning in many areas, the Russian army will be left with a lot of tension, and this will be the basis for a change of power in Russia.